very philosophical inclinations in his worldview. And my mother went to Berkeley, and that says enough.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So, you know, she was very active in the civil rights movement. I mean, I grew up, you know, she took me when I was 12 to the Soledad brothers.
Oh, yes. This was in the 60s, yes.
Yeah, to George Jackson's prison trial, just to see, you know, what was happening, that there were political struggles going on in this country. She was very opposed to the Vietnam War. So I did grow up
with a lot of awareness.
With a lot of awareness, social awareness, very much so. And certainly about the inequities in our culture. System. You know, because we grew up in an area that is, you know, probably a more wealthier area. I mean, my family, my close family, there's wealth in my family. My particular family was not wealthy at all. So I did not grow up wealthy by any means. In fact, quite probably more the other end.
But idea-wise...
But definitely the area we were in was quite wealthy. And so I think my mother was, you know, wanted to make us sure that we understood that this country has a lot of inequities. So, you know, my sister was in Selma, Alabama, marching with, you know, I mean, that's the type of background that we were raised in. And the 60s was a fascinating time in this country. You know, Berkeley was right across the street from where I grew up, quite literally. I mean, it wasn't far at all. And we were aware that there were big things happening, you know, in the States. So I think initially, you know, my parents... they were just perplexed more than anything, and my mother's always been very accepting of whatever any of her children have done. So
you went to England, and then you...
I went to England, and I was with a community there, and was studying, and they were probably more spiritually inclined, and although there was a
were these the Naqshbandis or
no, but probably there was a lot of political emphasis too, that Islam is a spiritual political movement. It's not politics without spirituality, and it's not spirituality with politics. So there was, I think, a balance.
You still agree with that, or you?
Oh, very much so. Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, we have a personal and a social transaction here.
Yes.
You know.
Right.
So I spent a few years in that community, and then what I...
But you're not doing anything particularly, you were just...
I was studying. I think I was studying very seriously.
Yes.
But then at a certain point, I realized that I wanted to learn Arabic, because I wanted to get into the sources, you know, to really experience Islam from the source. And I think being at that age, because I'm still only at this point about 22, for me, it was still probably one of these things that could go either way. You know, there were a lot of people dabbling in religions in the 60s and 70s, and, you know, you become a Buddhist for a few years. And
the transitions are, you know.
Yeah, so people did their religion thing in the 60s and 70s.
60s was very much in.
Yeah, and early 70s also.
Yeah.
You know, it started changing with... you know, I mean, certainly 69 was a big turning point because of the Manson thing that happened in this country. But, you know, and then Jonestown was a major disaster to the idea of communities and religious communities. So I think those things were going on, but I definitely wanted to study the tradition from the sources, and I got the opportunity from a sheikh who was from Sharjah, Sheikh Abdullah Ali Mahmoud, who was kind of a minister without portfolio.
He was in England at that time.
He was in England, and I met him, and I was just starting to learn Arabic. And he gave me an opportunity to go to the Emirates, and so I went to the United Arab Emirates, and I entered into a Islamic institute there in Al Ain, and I studied there, and I spent 4 years there. And then I actually became an imam in a small mosque in
Sharjah.
In Al Ain.
In Al Ain.
Yeah. And I lived there, and alhamdulillah, it was a very good experience for me. And then during that time, I had met West African scholars and became very interested in traditional Islam that was still being taught in West Africa. And I started studying with them personally, and I had one of them actually ended up living with me in the apartment that I was living at, and teaching me personally. So I learned a lot during that period. And then I decided to actually go to
West Africa.
Yeah, West Africa. And that began a whole another journey.
So there you spent quite a bit of time, as I understand.
Yeah, I was overseas almost 10 years.
Yeah. And there again, you were just learning or teaching, or?
No, I was pretty much committed just to learning, and I was a mu'adhin
where was this?
At one mosque in Al-Ain.
Yes.
Because I didn't want to live anymore in the institute's dorm, because they were very young. I don't think a lot of them were as serious as I was, and you know, they were just young high school students, and I was a little older. And I think I was probably more serious about what I was doing. Not all of them. I mean, certainly there were some very good people, but I didn't like the environment. So I asked somebody who was at the Ministry of Endowments, Religious Endowments, if they could work out a situation where I could be a mu'adhin and just live in, because the mosques have in those countries, they have living quarters next to them for the mu'adhin and for the imam. So I didn't take money for the work that I was doing. I had a stipend from this institute, not very much, but
it was enough to get by.
Yeah, and so they let me do that. I was a mu'adhin, and I lived in the mosque, and then I became, after a year of doing that, I learned not very much, but I learned the last portions of the Quran quite well, and could write them, recite them well. So they let me become an imam in another mosque that was near there.
Yeah.
And people were very generous to me. That they used to bring me food and things like that.
But you were now, going through several different cultures all of a sudden within a short period of time, in about 5-10 years.
Yeah. And
here you were up in Northern California, having exposure to Berkeley and all the things that you alluded to. Going to England, where different culture, practically, I mean, although it's Western culture, but then you were interacting with different people. Now, in all of this, your obvious contact with was Muslims, and they were from many different parts of the world, as I understand.
So what was happening?
Yes, that was the question.
Well, that's a good question, and I think for me it was a big shock, because I think when I became Muslim here, I had no idea, because I knew so little about Islam and about Muslim cultures and about Muslim peoples, and I mean, really vague ideas in my mind about, and then suddenly, there's all this Hollywood stupidity starts reemerging into the subconscious, Saracens with their sabers at the gates, Allahu Akbar, and Sinbad, and all this nonsense coming out of the subconscious. So, yeah, that thrust me on just having a look at a whole, and that was a big shock for me, realizing, first of all...
Did it make you sort of doubt your sanity about, or your validity of going into Islam at that point? The reason I ask that is...
No, that's a good question, because I think there was a period early on in which I did start questioning that. Have I done the right thing? Is this really... And I think that is part of what really inspired me to want to study the teaching deeply.
That's interesting.
Just to find out, I'd given up my past, my background, in a sense, my country. It was a very alienating experience, and now I'm kind of wondering, looking around at the Muslims and the prospects of the Muslims, it was kind of discouraging. And so I think that's a good question, because I think I did have that period. And it's hard, we have this fascinating self-delusional states in which we try to remember what actually happened, and we often create, inventing memory is a fascinating thing, because I've tried to do this, read piece. Did this really happen, or did and in many ways, I mean, I think this whole idea of past lives is just our own lives. It's not about living, I mean, how many lives have you had? Have you thought about that? It's fascinating.
I'm still thinking about it.
Exactly. You think the time when you're a student, wow, that was a past life for me. My pre-Islamic life was a past life for me. My childhood was a past life. So I think reincarnation is just... It happens in our own lifetime, No,
actually, the reason I asked also this question is that I've sat across with different people who have converted, and when I've asked them after conversion whether they relented at any point, whether they had any doubts, it's always that they say that it happened when they suddenly met a whole lot of Muslims, and with their diversity and complexity and their attitudes and the whole interaction